2020 was not a good year. You know what this is, so I'm going to spare the details. You also don't need an explanation as to why a disease growing exponentially across the entire planet is a problem. This was to be expected. Scientists have been warning about this happening for years. Like, if you Google pandemic before 2020, it becomes very apparent of the likelihood of this happening. The world should have been prepared. A place that should have been especially prepared is the United States of America, the richest country on planet Earth, and it was left fumbling to get supplies in the very early stages. There's really no excuse for this, for a country with this vast amount of wealth to perform so terribly. Fentanyl would give America a very, very not good. I don't even watch fentanyl like that. A place that was really prepared for the pandemic is the country of South Korea. And wow, no, that is not a glitch. And it's not like the country wasn't reporting their cases. This is what happens when you have robust testing and public health protocols. The country has dealt with a rapidly spreading epidemic before. It was MERS in 2014. This event taught leaders that another event like this was bound to happen again. So, when it came around the next time, they were extremely prepared at flattening the curve and was able to avert the very worst of the pandemic compared to some other countries. But the story of the first index case is a very interesting one. The first case was confirmed by South Korean health authorities to be that of a 61-year-old man who went to Wuhan, who traveled as part of a church. The name of that church is the Sincheonji Church. The Sincheonji Church is a Christian new religious movement established by Lee Man-hee. They are apocalyptic and believe that their leader, Lee, is the Messiah. In February 2020, the church came under intense scrutiny during the beginnings of the pandemic in South Korea, and at least half of the cases at the very beginning were belonging to this sect. Their ceremonial practice made them especially vulnerable to the pandemic because the church meetings were set up in which congregants would sit 5 centimeters apart, that's 2 inches, and would amen after every sentence from the pastor, a perfect recipe for spreading disease. But around this time, a similar event like this that was much less reported on would begin to catch my eye. At the beginning of the same month of February 2020, still the beginnings of the pandemic, I remember seeing a video of this mass wedding taking place in the country, from couples all around the world going to South Korea to get married, which I found out is run by another New Age religion. Like, why, of all places, for this to happen, be South Korea? I'm not saying the country is bad or anything, because it's obviously not. It's a very beautiful country, filled with nice and wonderful people. But when I think of South Korea, I think of K-dramas, K-pop, and very damaging and unrealistic beauty standards. I'm not thinking of couples going to get married there en masse. I did some research, and I found out the organization behind the marriages. They're called the Unification Church. And the more and more I looked into the organization, I was astonished at what I found. When I started writing this, I thought this would be just some minor thing. But the more and more I've dug into this, it has only gotten bigger and bigger. This is a story that has become a lot bigger than I would ever have anticipated. And to do this story justice, we gotta leave this place. Far, far beyond this place. Way far. To truly start this story, we must go to Japanese-occupied Korea, Pyongyang, in the 1920s. Sun Myung Moon was born on January 6, 1920, and spent his life in abject poverty. His family followed Confucian beliefs before his family joined the local Presbyterian church. Things would change for him when, as he claims, on Easter Sunday, 1936, at 16 years old, he went up to the mountains to pray. He is said to have seen gold-tipped clouds. Jesus appeared to him and placed his hand on his head and told him to take on an unspecified special mission on earth. Moon said he was unworthy. Then he claims other prophets appeared to him, like Buddha and Confucius. He came from the mountains transformed. The second coming, the one to unite the entire world. Moon's enemy was not the Japanese, it was the devil. Moon went to college in Japan and worked for Korean independence while he was in university. After college, he moved back to Seoul, got married, had a child, and left two of his wives, Choi Seon-gil and Kim Chong-hwa. Around the same time, Japan had surrendered to the Americans, ending Japanese occupation of Korea. With a new sense of religious freedom and a claimed calling from God, he told his wife he was going to buy some rice and never came back. He had a calling from God to preach in North Korea. And I mean, what's the worst that can happen? He was arrested by North Korean authorities in 1947. Not for preaching, if you believe it, but shockingly, for bigamy. He was sent to a labor camp where he was tortured for 3 years, where he won't have any hard feelings toward North Korea and their ideology. I mean, none. Moon escaped due to a UN bombing raid of the Heung Nam labor camp. After escaping the camp with his life, he began to preach again, and in 1954, he got married to his second and final wife, Hak Ja-han, in 1960, and founded the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. The Unification Church was born. And before we move along to the rest of Moon's timeline, I want to talk about some basic practices and theology of the Unification Church to paint an overall better picture of what the church is and what it wants to do, because there is some vital information going forward. Moon is known as the true father, his wife the true mother, they are the true parent, and his family, well, the true family. And if you are a follower of the church, the true children, a group of people that God has chosen as examples that humanity should follow. Moon's family is massive, so I am only going to reference the key players so this video doesn't balloon too big. There's Sun Myung Moon, the main focus of this video. His wife, Hak Chang-han, second wife and current leader of the Unification Church, and she took over after Moon's death. Inchon Tatiana Moon is a former president of the church, and she has some I-home church that she does. Heung Moon is estranged from the family and is known for professionally horse riding. Julia Moon, a ballerina and widow of Heung Jim Moon, runs Universal Ballet in South Korea. And that's the main key players. There can't possibly be anyone else. Nope, no one else. The main text that they follow is the divine principle, and to brutally oversimplify, because this video is going to be long enough as it is, this text is a new revelation from God that was delivered to Moon. Just like other Christian sequel books, like the Book of Mormon for example, it has a lot of core Christian beliefs, with the divine principle being supplemental material to the Old and New Testaments. One key difference between them is that the divine principle states that Jesus was the second Adam, from Adam and Eve, and he was to form the perfect marriage. Moon is a different person from Jesus and wants to replace all other forms of Christianity and unify them. The blessing ceremony, as you can tell from the title of this video, is a practice by the church to marry couples and free them from their original sin, from Adam and Eve. Back in the day, Moon would play divine matchmaker and join random couples, but he stopped doing that around 2001. As you notice, random couples from different backgrounds are matched together. This is what the Moonies, I'll explain later on, are mostly known for. These massive mass marriages taking place, like the one that took place in Madison Square Garden in 1982. One last thing I want to bring up is the concept of separation. Here in the United States, we have this thing called the separation of church and state. The church does church stuff, the government does government stuff. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. That is not how the church operates. The politics of the church and their religion are intertwined. The same goes for their business arm. The church is political. The torture that Moon faced in North Korea shaped him politically. The church is a business. To quote L. Ron Hubbard, he may have not have said this, but you'll get the point. If you want to get rich, you start a religion. And the church is very, very, very rich, with a lot of friends in high places. After the church's founding, the church quickly expanded in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and other countries in East Asia, which is kind of weird how this small church was able to grow so fast. Well, they had some help. You see, during the early years of the church had a ton of members from the Korean military and the intelligence service. Some would go even as far that the church was straight up organized by the KCIA and its first director, Kim Jong-pil. The prominence of the church was first noticed during the 1961 Korean coup, where members held key posts in the military and the intelligence services. We don't know why he did this, but one theory is that Moon's Confucius Christianity, with a healthy dash of anti-communism on the side, would be a good counter to Kim Il-sung's Juche ideology. This is just a theory. This would be revealed much later on in the story. But for now, it's time to spread the gospel and do God's work. And if you want to stop the devil, there's one place you must go to: America. Moon first arrived in the United States in 1965, but he didn't fully move to the States until 1971. This is where the Moonies, a nickname for the followers of Moon that has since fallen out of favor, started getting media attention, where they would have converts selling flowers in the streets and trying to convert college students using deceptive tactics. But as the 70s moved along, the church fell out the view of the media, as they moved along to other groups. The 1970s was not a good time for the country, especially the younger generation. The Vietnam War, where they or their friends might be conscripted to fight a war they very, very, very much did not approve of. And the Watergate scandal, a scandal so infamous that whenever there's a new scandal, they still add the suffix "gate" to it, to this very day. And if you're wondering where the American cynicism of the government being good and can do good things for people, this is that point in American history. To simplify what happened, Nixon was scared he was going to lose the election to Liberal Senator George McGovern. McGovern was not popular, but Nixon and his re-election committee sent robbers to break into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. Did he need to do this? Well, to answer that, let's look at the 1972 election results and... Oh. The answer is no. No, he did not. Yeah. Remember when I said McGovern wasn't popular? He only won D.C. and Massachusetts. McGovern was most likely going to lose the election anyway. But well, Dickie is always tricky. That was a bad joke. Nixon was diminished. His image toxic, facing impeachment in the House and enough votes in the Senate to be removed from office. What type of person would support him at his lowest moment? Moon, of course. That's right. Moon was a big supporter of Nixon while he was dealing with the Watergate scandal, holding rallies in support of Nixon, with his supporters wanting Moon to give a joint session of Congress. Nixon would resign from the presidency in August 1974, and like I said earlier, the church fell out of the media spotlight. While that happened, the church's influence would grow ever more. The moon is bigger than we expected. This is not a story of some random church. This is also the story of a church where a Korean man believes he's the second coming of Christ and comes to be one of the lesser known key players in conservative politics in the United States and other countries, whose enormous influence is still being felt to this day. It's time to go to the... Crap, I already did the cool intro. Crap. Well, since Moon is the man that finished Jesus' mission on earth, Jesus escaped death through his resurrection. But as the saying goes, there's only two things certain in life: death and taxes. From 1976 onward, the church has been under investigation from Congress, and they've been looking at the influence that they have in the country, and whether or not the church is strictly a church and not an organ of the South Korean government. A scandal that would involve the church was called Koreagate. Told you Gate was going to be used for everything. Then again, Watergate just happened a couple years ago. The scandal was about Tong Sun Park, a well-known South Korean lobbyist who was known as the Asian Great Gatsby, who used money from the South Korean government to lobby the United States to keep troops in the country. Years after the scandal, Park would be a well-known man in DC, having a well-connected social club, and was known for fraternizing with the top people in the United Nations. He would later be convicted years later for money laundering for Saddam Hussein. Park testified in the Koreagate case in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Moon ran in similar circles of the Korean government, like Park, but the church had similar yet different goals. The congressional investigation only focused on the Korean government lobbying of Congress for obvious reasons, but they didn't look into the Japanese connection, which is a story for another time. The Fraser Committee was only investigating the KCIA, but they soon found out the church involvement was everywhere. Remember, to Moon, there is no difference between politics, business, and religion. For Moon, they're all the same to him. Moon's second in command, Bo Hee-pak, testified to Congress, and he has got to be one of the most difficult congressional witnesses in congressional history. The situation was already embarrassing for the church, and he would ask for time over and over and over and over again. Pak would keep on attacking again and again, calling Fraser an enemy of Korea and giving aid and comfort to the Soviet Union. The church even produced a propaganda film about the investigation, and they claimed it was a witch hunt. The movie is called Truth Is My Sword, and the film stars Bo Hee-pak and the supposed takedown of Fraser and the committee, and they call Fraser an agent of Moscow. Now, that claim is completely baseless, and also, it's not like Pak wouldn't know anything about that. No, he has no experience doing that at all. The film ends by saying the church was proven innocent and Moon's honor was restored.
Shortly after Mr. Fraser's election defeat, the subcommittee issued its final report. The Unification Church was proven innocent, and Reverend Moon's honor was restored.
I don't know about that, Chief. And yes, Fraser was a liberal member of Congress with a strong record of protecting human rights, foreign aid, and the environment, but the weakness on communism claim and giving aid to the Soviets is something that has been said ad nauseum, but never had any merit. And I know it's a diversion, but I have to take a quick look at democratic presidential policies on Soviet Union and communism. It's not something that I want to do specifically, but I have to due to the church's theology and who the church support going forward. The Fraser hearings was held in the late 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president, and his policies had a focus on human rights when it came to foreign policy. But weakness in the church's eyes is to not be as hard line as them. But Jimmy Carter followed the standard line that every single president did, at least more or less when it came to the Soviet Union. He recognized the People's Republic of China along with his NSA advisor, Brzezinski, because they wanted to isolate the Soviets, just like Nixon had done previously. Harry Truman started the containment policy, JFK, and you know the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
The Russians? They're not all bad.
How about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Has moved nuclear warheads into Cuba, pointed them right at us.
That was real? I saw that movie. I thought it was...
The Soviets made a deal with the Cuban government to put nuclear weapons on the island in response to the US putting nuclear missiles in Turkey. Turkey was on the border of the Soviet Union. LBJ, JFK's vice president. After Barry Goldwater was the 1964 Republican nominee, he talked about the Democrats being soft on communism. And LBJ said, "You really think that? I'ma pull a pro-gamer move and win by a landslide." He used a fake attack by the Vietnamese to start the basis of the Vietnam War. The US was actually the ones going to North Vietnamese territory and performing raids in their territory. He also increased presidential power immensely and passed the Gulf on Tonkin resolution that allowed the president to conduct the war any way they see fit. Looking at his approval rating, maybe that wasn't a good idea, but he did win by a landslide, in part by painting Barry Goldwater as an extremist. So, they were weak on communism. Soviet puppets, I guess. Moving back to Bo Hipok's testimony, Bo sued Fraser for what he claims was that Fraser was trying to trick him and pay witnesses that were adversarial to the church. Also sued the New York Times and other organizations. Not because they thought these lawsuits had any merit to them. They knew they were going to be dismissed, but to tie people's time and to send a message on if you're going to say anything critical about the church. The role that Bo Hipok was supposed to play was to be the fall guy, so Moon wouldn't be dragged in to testify. Fraser then threatened to use his subpoena powers so that Moon would have to testify. But before his 2 weeks were up, he flew to London and Korea. I mean, not because he didn't want to testify. He'll accept the subpoena only if the heads of the Baptists, the Jews, the Methodists, plus Pope Paul, Billy Graham, Oral Roberts, Also, there was a mass wedding he had to be at, That's kind of important, Moon did return back to the United States in November 1978. 1 week after the committee hearings were stopped, Moon supporters claimed that Fraser was using the committee to increase his chances of becoming a U.S. Senator. But there's one thing I know that American voters vote on, and that's foreign policy. Come on, they do that. To be serious, rarely, and I mean rarely, do US voters care about foreign policy. They do not care about foreign policy. And honestly, Fraser knew it too. He knew the longer he stayed in Washington, the less time he would have to fight a strong primary challenge. Members of Congress rarely lose their primaries. Fraser lost his, but only narrowly, most likely due to large Republican crossover. A couple days after he lost, his house was set on fire, and we still don't know who did it to this very day. But for now, it is a good time to look at the congressional report on the church that was included in the overall report on Korean-American relations. But for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to read the summary. Sun Myung Moon is the head of the church. He wants a worldwide government governed by Moon and his followers. While working to pursue its own goals, they did work with the South Korean government to pursue mutual interest. They raised funds to gain political influence in the United States for them and the South Korean government. Despite Moon's organization's cooperative relationship with the ROK government, the UC was far less influential as a religious movement in Korea than elsewhere. The Moon organization used church and other tax-exempt components to support its political and economic activities. Although many of the goals and activities of the Moon organization were legitimate and lawful, there was evidence that it had systematically violated U.S. tax, immigration, banking, currency, and Foreign Agents Registration Act laws, as well as state and local laws related to charity fund, and these violations were related to the organization's overall goals of gaining temporal power. This report was released in 1978, and it wouldn't get better for Moon soon afterwards. From Moon's camp, they claim that he was arrested because he was a martyr, and he was persecuted due to the United States government being racist. And yes, the government has done a lot of racist stuff. But do you expect me to believe that he wasn't arrested not due to, the tax evasion? Later on, you will see why I believe this claim is completely bogus. The Moon organization is a good name to describe what the church is and isn't. Yes, it is a church, new religious movement, or whatever new name they decide to call themselves. Which is a lot. I mean a lot. There are so many front companies that would take too much time to name. But what gives the church its immense power is its business activities and its ties to people in power. Its business activities include factories in Asia producing paint, soda, ginseng, weapons, stoneworks, machine parts, a football club they sold recently, diamond and jewelry companies, TV post-production studios, health food, software, fish, including sushi, which, fun fact, the church played an important part in popularizing sushi in America. I had no idea. The church owns numerous properties as well, such as the New Yorker Hotel and the wire service United Press International, Manhattan's Hammerstein Ballroom, that's right, the famous ECW arena. But among the more notable things that the church owns are media properties, such as the Sekai Nippo in Japan, the Seigei Ibo in Korea, and the crown jewel of the church, the Washington Times newspaper. On May 17, 1982, the Times released their first issue. The very next day, Moon was convicted on all counts to file false income tax returns, to obstruct justice, and to make false statements to government officials, and to make false statements to a grand jury. But the 1980s, as a whole, was filled with great triumph and great despair for Moon. So let's start with one of his greatest success stories, the Washington Times. I'm going to devote an entire section of this chapter on the Washington Times, and I have to because the newspaper is one of the church's most powerful assets. Now, obviously, where the money is coming from is very important as well, but like I said, that is a story for another time. Moon always knew how powerful the media was. His first newspaper, The News World, later renamed the New York City Tribune, that ran out in New York. That was his first endeavor in the newspaper business. The Washington Times is a conservative newspaper that runs out of Washington, D.C., and I mean barely. If you were to compare it to the Washington Post, it is literally located a couple blocks from the White House. But the Times is located near the border with Maryland. In comparison with the Examiner, the Times is more of a second-rate paper at this point in time. The reason why Moon created the Washington Times in the first place was due to the supposed liberal media bias of the Washington Post and the power that owning a newspaper brings you. For example, if you run articles supporting the president's policies, maybe you might get exclusive access to stories, give you special interviews. I'm just saying. The reason why I added air quotes to liberal media bias, because it doesn't have the same meaning like it does today. Because when I think of progressive time periods in America, I think of the 1980s. Also, it would be extremely beneficial for the church to have a newspaper at the heart of the capital of the United States of America, the most powerful country on planet Earth.
Washington is the most important single city in the world. If you can achieve influence, if you can achieve visibility, if you can achieve a measure of respect in Washington, then you fairly automatically are going to achieve these things in the rest of the world. There is no better agency or entity or instrument that I know of for achieving power here or almost anywhere else than a newspaper.
Katharine Graham, a member of the Graham family who owned the Post, became president of the paper and led it through the 1960s to the 1990s. She didn't get the accusations of bias because while the family was close to the Kennedys, they also talked to Democrats and Republicans alike. A more big club and you ain't in it type of feeling if you ask me. But conservatives at the time believed that the old liberal worldview could never be fair to Reagan and his policies. I mean, look at what happened to Nixon. We need Star Wars. We must prioritize stopping communism no matter the cost. The background of the paper goes like this. The Washington Star newspaper was closing down, and Larry Moffat, a top official in the church, was trying to convince James R. Whalen, who was going to take a job with the Sacramento Union, a conservative alternative to the Bee. After Moffat and Bohe Pak had persistent talks with Whalen, he relented and became the first editor-in-chief for the Washington Times. Whalen was promised editorial control and that the church would not interfere with the paper. And, well, we know that wasn't gonna last long. He resigned at a news conference saying the paper became a Mooney paper.
The Washington Times has become a Mooney newspaper.
Former Newsweek editor Arnold de Borchgrave became the Times' second editor-in-chief, and he's a member of Belgian royalty. At this point in time, this is where the paper really picked up steam, sharpening its conservative worldview and became an important part of conservative news diets. The church claims that the paper is independent of the church, but the church has regularly interfered with articles and journalists who work on a routine basis. A great example of this type of interference is during his tenure, some journalists, along with Bill Chesser, wanted to do an editorial on the brutal practices of the South Korean dictatorship that killed hundreds of democracy protesters in a 1980s crackdown. They were blocked from covering the story. And I wonder why. It's very curious. 5 journalists resigned in protest, and it's a lot harder to justify when one person leaves, like with Whalen, than 5 people leaving in response to interfering with their work. The church also blocked a critical movie review of the movie Inchon, a film produced with financial support from the church, and the movie is really bad. And I know this section is on how the Washington Times and how it helps the church in terms of its influence, but the story behind this movie is absolutely insane. The Battle of Inchon is a famous battle during the Korean War, and it could make for a great war movie. But no. It starred famous actor Laurence Olivier and had the director of 3 James Bond films, Terrence Young. This movie was made around the time the church's headquarters moved from South Korea to the United States. He wanted to make a movie on Jesus or Elvis Presley, but settled on famous General Douglas MacArthur. Moon, in researching for this project, hired famous astrologer Janine Dixon to channel Douglas MacArthur from the spirit world. Wait, did I forget to tell you that Moon regularly talked to famous people from the spirit world? Yep, he talked to around 36 US presidents, and you can hear stunning testimonials on how Moon is the Messiah and why we should listen to him. Moon paid no expense when it came to casting. So, why did the movie fail so badly? Well, rumors began that the film was written by the KCIA and that the church was financially supporting the film, and that the US Defense Department retracted extras. Filming took place a few miles from the Korean DMZ, so that didn't help. Commanders would routinely abuse crew members, and Moon brought in church members from around the world, so many different languages were being spoken at once. It's just an insane story about quite possibly of one of the worst movies ever made, and I wish I can go into more detail. Why did Sir Laurence Olivier even decide to be a part of this film? His response explains everything. People ask me why I'm playing in this picture. The answer is simple. Money, dear boy. Moon may have not found any fans of his films, but he did find a big fan of his newspaper, and they had a huge one. It was none other than the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. His former chief of staff, Don Reagan, has said he quoted the Times more than any other newspaper and would regularly give the paper interviews. The paper would regularly run articles that supported the Reagan administration policies, famously the policies in Latin and Central America. He loved the Times for their positive coverage of him, and has gone on to say it was the first paper he read every morning. He gave a video message in support of the Times in 1997.
The American people know the truth, and you, my friends at the Washington Times, have told it to them. It wasn't always the popular thing to do, but you were a loud and powerful voice. Like me, you arrived in Washington at the beginning of the most momentous decade of the century. Together, we rolled up our sleeves and got to work. And, oh yes, we won the Cold War. You faithfully chronicled these dramatic events, as well as mirroring the new sense of optimism I felt America needed. Once again, America stood like a shining city on the hill.
The Birch grave was replaced with the Times' third and longtime editor, Wesley Pruden. And to get a feel for the paper's editorial style after the Borchgrave left, we should look at some of the people who were in charge during this time period. Pruden, a former editor, would routinely run Civil War columns every Saturday in the paper, which, that sounds harmless. There's nothing wrong with that. No, he said the Union should be glorified just like the Confederacy, and defending the old South way of doing things. Every year, I make sure that we have a story in the paper about any observance of Robert E. Lee's birthday, and the fact that it falls around MLK's birthday. You know, two people fighting for similar goals, I guess. The sins of the father are not sins of the son, but his dad, Wesley Pruden Sr., said his three main enemies are, that's what we gotta fight, communists and cops. That sounds Old South to me. To get an even better feeling of the new direction that Pruden took the paper, another editor, Pruden's hand-picked successor as editor-in-chief, was Francis Coombs, said that George H.W. Bush should look into at what David Duke was tapping into.
I'd like to really stress this difference. We can talk all day long about Duke parading around in a Nazi uniform. We can talk all day long about Duke being a former Ku Klux Klan wizard, but this guy is tapping into something more than racism. I think Metzger, in large part, tapped into. I think his racial message is what got him, what earned him his little bit of success. But I think Duke is hitting something much more than a racist message, and I feel strongly about that. And I think Bush and the people inside the Beltway are missing that.
I wonder what he was tapping into. You know, coming from a former Klan Grand Wizard. Fun fact, he almost won a Senate seat in 1990s in Louisiana. 43% of the vote. That's a lot. He gave speeches hailing Jefferson Davis, he was friends with Samuel Francis, and Pruden was forced to fire him due to being called out by Dinesh D'Souza. Coombs also reportedly said when a colleague of his George Archibald showed him a picture of his nephew's black girlfriend, he replied, "The N-word of occasion of America." He said, "Not in my lifetime. If my daughter went out with a black, I would cut her." I'm not saying this. Oh, it gets even better. His wife, Marion Coombs, is friends with Jared Taylor and Nick Griffin, former head of the British National Party. And the best way to describe their politics is like, you know Kanye, right? Kanye, yeah, that Kanye.
I'm done with the classifications. Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table, especially Hitler.
Yeah. There are more examples of this type of behavior happening during this time period, and as much as I am criticizing them, there are still actual journalists who work there and produce good work. Also, Coombs was very unpopular with the staff. The church knew these were terrible comments, and this type of behavior is very bad for the public image of the paper. One of Moon's sons, who isn't important, I will never reference him at all, ever, dismissed Coombs due to his comments. The paper did change direction somewhat, with the new editor-in-chief, John Solomon, who was from the Associated Press. And he took some time cleaning up a lot of the stuff in the paper, like in terms of wording, like aliens to immigrants. The church didn't like that and brought the paper back closer to them. Why did Moon and the church let Coombs and Pruden stay in place for so long? Power. They wanted to keep connections in the White House. He can't let the billions of dollars he spent propping up this paper just go to waste. The paper did change somewhat, but now the paper's readership is third rate at best, with other conservative publications being much more popular. But the paper was never created for journalism. That wasn't the purpose. It was for power. It was to be used like an iron rod by Moon to crush his opponents. To quote Moon himself, with the Washington Times as the core, we are establishing preeminence in the American print media. By doing so, we can include all fields of intelligence. Today, we have in this area surpassed the liberal New York Times and Washington Post and are continually gaining important confidential information not only from America but also from other governments all over the world. Moon was convicted on all charges in 1982, imprisoned in 1984, and was released from prison in 1985. Now, I think it's a good time to talk about the despair that Moon faced during this decade. While Moon was in federal prison for tax evasion, one of Moon's children, Heung Jim Moon, died in a car crash. He was 17 years old. There were 2 other people in the car with him on that day, and they swear that if it wasn't for his swift action, they would be dead as well. Among the family, he was known as one of the nicest. It's not the first time one of Moon's children has died. Heung Jim Moon died from a heart attack. Young Jin Moon fell from a Reno, Nevada hotel, which was ruled a suicide by the police. Heung Jin was supposed to marry Bo Hee Pak's daughter, Hoon Suk Julia Pak. But the marriage continued on. Over the course of this video, I have spent a great amount of its time critiquing the church. And I just want to point out that this is a truly nice act of remembering one of your children that was supposed to be married and continuing on with it. It does seem kind of strange for people in the West to see this, but this is a truly heartwarming act for them to do this. And I salute them. Which is why I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I have to pull the rug out now. You want to know why? You want to know why? It seems too good to be true. Because you really want to know why? Because in 1987, church missionaries in Zimbabwe met a man named Clopius Kuyonda, a miracle man, and they announced that he is the moon son that died in the car crash. Everyone, please welcome Black Heung Jim Nim. This story is already insane enough on its own, but to boil it down, here's what happened. After the reveal of Black Heung Jim, he was shown to Reverend Chung Hwan Kwok, a rival of Bo Hipok, and announced to him that he has the embodiment of Heung Jim Nim 24 hours a day. He was brought to Sun Myung Moon, and he was tested on whether or not was he truly his son in a new body. You know, normal things. Clopius lacked Heung Jin's knowledge. He didn't even know Korean. What was Moon's response to this so-called reincarnated son of his after failing the very basics? He passed him. He passed the test. Clopius would go around to other church locations around the world and see how they could save money. And this is where the funny part of the story ends. Because Clopius was extremely abusive. People started showing up with black eyes. He shot firearms and make them try to look for the bullet. He would tie people to radiators, make people crawl on their hands, and would routinely beat people unconscious, men and women, even while women were pregnant. Moon didn't seem quite bothered by the numerous reports of violence and seemed quite pleased. According to his daughter-in-law, Clopius beat Bo Hipok so badly that he needed brain surgery. By 1988, they claimed the spirit of Heung Jin has left him, and they sent him back to Zimbabwe, where he is currently active in the country's brutal politics, where, allegedly, he is still beating people. Students at one of his colleges he owns staged a protest to stop his abusive treatment. Oh my God. This man makes Sun Myung Moon look like a saint, and that's saying a lot. Really, it is. There's a tactic where the church regularly beats people. He's known for being abusive to his daughters and saying it's the love of God. Holy crap. Moon did try to get Ronald Reagan to pardon him, but was unsuccessful. As Reagan wrote in his diary, Senator Hatch is after me to grant clemency to the Reverend Moon. I have explored it, and I find I just can't. One of the reasons is that the Reagan administration was embarrassed on how close they were working with the church in Latin America, which requires a breakdown of U.S. foreign policy in Central and South America. Yay. The 1980s was the last decade of the Cold War. The Cold War was an indirect war for spheres of influence. The First World, America and its allies, the Second World, the Soviets and their allies, and the Third World, which was everyone else. The stakes were extremely high because both of these countries have weapons that, if used, will kill all life on planet Earth and leave the planet uninhabitable for generations. Yay? Yeah, the two countries didn't get along, as you can probably tell. The United States had a policy called containment, essentially trying to stop or limit its spread of communism by any means necessary. If they succeed in one country, it might spread to the others and keep on going, leaving the United States isolated and having to deal with pro-Soviet governments in their own hemisphere. A camp of conservative foreign policy thinkers thought the policy of containment was ineffective to stopping communism, and the only way to stop it was to be more forceful, basically fighting them wherever they're at. Obviously, Reagan loved this. To get a sense on what Reagan thought on what the US had to do in order to win the Cold War, he said this in a previous interview. Here's my strategy on the Cold War. We win, they lose. I can't really argue with that strategy. Doesn't matter with me, Chief. If you hate commies, you're okay in my book. Human rights, democracy? Where does Sun Myung Moon fit into all of this? One of Moon's life goals was destroying communism by any means necessary. Moon sees commies when he goes to sleep at night. One of the reasons why the KCIA picked Moon over the other so-called messiahs, because, hey, plenty of people claim to be the second coming of Christ, is his hard-on against communism. Moon founded an organization called CASA, or Cause in Spanish, which they pumped millions of dollars into anti-communist organizing and propaganda in Central and South America. Also, it would be very good cover to grow the church's base by adding new members in the continent. But the two famous examples of the church's involvement during this time period was in Nicaragua and Bolivia. So let's see what happened there. For Nicaragua, the Moon organization worked with the Contras. My first knowledge of this event even happening was the famous American Dad song, Aniran Contra. But I will not try to be boring while explaining this. Nicaragua had a US-backed dictator, which was an extremely common thing in the region for decades. The government was very corrupt, as you can obviously tell, but the country's breaking point was the 1972 earthquake, which left widespread infrastructural damage and left many people homeless. The Somoza regime used international aid that was supposed to help with relief efforts, but used them to enrich its inner circle. As you can see, this is a major problem. The regime collapsed and the Sandinistas were able to get in control of the government. When the Sandinistas took control of the government, they knew who called the shots in the hemisphere: the United States. But they did not want to be on the US leash due to the past history between the two countries, and let's face it, the entire Americas. They said no to rejecting the aid and friendship of Cuba. The more Washington tried to influence them, the more the Sandinistas' resolve would strengthen. So obviously, the United States saw this as growing evidence of a dictatorship. U.S. national security agencies took the remnants of Somoza's National Guard and people disenchanted with the new government to create a counter-revolution. The name of this new group would go on to be called the Contras. After Reagan came into office, he let the foreign policy hardliners and warhawks took over policy for Central and South America. They came in with the mindset that they could support terrible regimes because the region was so unimportant, and any fallout from supporting these regimes and terrible people could easily be handled. Hopefully, the Contras won't do anything bad that would bring attention to Reagan. Nope. Argentina would oversee the Contras due to ideological agreement in improving U.S. relations, which was strained under the Carter administration. The U.S. would bring the money. The news media started reporting that the U.S. was supporting the Contras, and liberal members of Congress thought the Reagan administration, what they were doing was completely illegal. So they introduced the Bolin Amendment, which forbade the government from overthrowing the Nicaraguan government and trying to start a war with the country of Honduras. This amendment had a lot of loopholes in it, and it didn't really affect the Reagan's administration policies, to be honest. Do you think Reagan would let the sissies in Congress stop him from fighting for freedom? Reagan gave the Contras a $19 million budget anyway. Attacks from the Contras continued to ramp up, and a proxy war was brewing between the Sandinista government and the Contra rebels, with the Contras committing way many more human rights violations, to the point that the vast majority of reports from this time period, that nearly all of them was coming from the side of the Contras. The Sandinistas became the de facto government in Nicaragua after winning in a landslide in the 1984 election, with the elections being monitored by countries like Canada and the EU and various other organizations, and was declared free and fair. Reagan called it a Soviet-styled sham. As the war kept ramping up, many in Congress thought the Reagan administration violated the Bolin Amendment. Members of both political parties got mad when the CIA didn't report to them on their activities of helping the Contras, which led to the second Bolin Amendment, which was a lot more strict in terms of government funding for the Contras. Essentially, they banned the government from using any money to support the Contras. Again, do you think Do you honestly think that Reagan would let the sissies in Congress stop him from fighting for freedom for a second time? This is where the administration started looking for other funding sources in a scandal that would come to be known as Iran-Contra, where the CIA sent excess weapons and supplies to Israel. Israel sold the weapons to Iran, which was at war with Iraq at the time, and Iran would buy those weapons for high prices. But Oliver North suggested in late 1985 to essentially, let's just cut out the middleman and sell weapons directly to Iran and give that money to the Contras, a country under an arms embargo. Not to mention, we were also giving weapons to Saddam Hussein, you know, the leader of Iraq, while they were fighting Iran. This was very illegal. Enter Moon stage right. You see, in March 1985, Lieutenant Oliver North sent a top secret memo to create a private foundation to fund the Contras and called it the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund. 2 months later, the Washington Times set up the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund. Wait a minute, that's the same name. They were also the first ones to give the fund money. It was $100,000. Moon worked extremely closely with the administration during this time period. After Congress cut off aid, it was to the point where you couldn't tell the difference between CIA operatives and members of the Unification Church. They were so interconnected that during this time period, a Pentagon analyst theorized that a journalist or Democratic operative could report on this, and it can seriously hurt the Reagan campaign by creating a major scandal right before the election. See that? That's the 1984 election results. In exchange for Reagan winning Massachusetts, they get Minnesota. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. The report also said that they had established a solid presence in the regions with ties to right-wing groups and US-supported guerrillas. So that's Nicaragua. What happened in Bolivia? Nothing really crazy happened, but the fact that the church worked with a man known as the Butcher, was the leader of the Gestapo in France. It was known as the Butcher of Leon, and created one of the first narco states in South America. Nothing major. Here's what happened. Klaus Barbie was a Gestapo leader in France. He tortured people, he was sadistic, he skinned people. When he tortured people, it made him happy. It filled him with joy. 14,000 people died because of his actions. Germany lost the war. Again, France found out that Barbie was being held in Germany, and they wanted to put him on trial for war crimes. And this is where the United States pulled an epic gamer move and was like, no, I don't think I will. And they helped him escape to Bolivia. Oh yeah, by the way, the US helped a whole bunch of these officials escape prosecution through a system called ratlines. That's great. And you know what? I'm gonna stop talking about it, and hopefully I won't have to talk about it again. It can't be that bad, right? They even helped us went to the moon. Anyways, Barbie, now going under his new name, Klaus Altman, where he was also a businessman in Bolivia, and he represented Merrick's, a firearms manufacturer where 3 million rounds were shipped to the Contras. See? Everything is connected. Barbie became high up in Bolivian intelligence and worked with higher ups, and was recruited by military dictator Hugo Benzer to renew their techniques for repression. After a quick succession of presidents, General Luis Garcia Meza wanted power, with the Carter administration's image tarnished at the time period and a Republican victory seeming ever more likely. He, along with the help of Barbie, drug traffickers, and others, he knew it was his time to pounce. Allegedly as well, Argentina's feared intelligence service, along with the help of young mercenaries from Europe, cocaine drug lords, all worked together to overthrow the democratically elected Bolivian government. Moon and his people worked with him because, of course they did. Barbie drew up the blueprints of the coup, and everyone knew who he was working for. The Americans. The Unification Church representative in Bolivia was a man by the name of Tom Ward. Tom Ward was also a CIA contact. And who did he work with? Klaus Altman. That's right, Barbie. The new Mesa regime wanted one thing and one thing only: a monopoly of the cocaine trade. The regime was known for its brutality. And that's really saying something, because this whole time period is known for its brutality. Also, the regime ties to drug traffickers and its criminal activities was so out in the open, it was too much to bear for international support. Any international support. This was too much for Reagan. Reagan. Do you know how hard that is to pull off? During this time period especially, Tom Ward expressed regret about the fall of Argentina and Bolivia. And allegedly, he said this: "It was also stupid having Moon and Casa here. You can't create a new order with the old Germans, with Hitler and all that. You have to find something modern. Your entire position is simply too reactionary. The whole affair with Altman, Barbie, with the whole fascism and Nazism bit, that was a dead-end street. You don't say." Following the fall of the Bolivian military dictatorship, a new elected democratic government had Barbie extradited to France in 1983 to face trial on crimes against humanity. When faced with his accusers during his trial, he responded with this: "Nothing to say." He played a key role in Latin American politics during the Cold War and had worked extensively with the United States and West Germany, even though they vehemently deny it, but the evidence is just too overwhelming. And Moon and the Unification Church played key roles in this place and during this time period. And these are just two examples of the church's influence in Latin America, but there are far more around this continent. You know, before writing this video, I already knew some of this stuff to begin with, but the sheer scale of it blows my mind. And the question you may be asking: why is this part of the despair section of Sun Myung Moon? He won. The West won the Cold War, and it is an emphatic victory, but the cost of that victory is rarely ever mentioned. If you've ever wondered why Latin America acts the way it does, then this is the point in history to look at. Why do you think drug cartels are so powerful in these parts of the world? This wasn't new, of course. The US supporting dictatorships ahead of the people's own interests is literally a centuries-old policy. The US worked with dictatorships, and remembering it was a hub for war criminals after World War II, helped fund cartels. It explains a lot, actually. Nearly every single US president supported these regimes with open arms. Republicans favored a more hardline stance, while Democrats took more measured approaches. And by measured approaches, I mean not giving these regimes everything that they wanted. A president that fulfills that criticism is Jimmy Carter. And now, there's lots of things you can criticize Jimmy Carter on. His domestic policies, his foreign policies. But like what I said before when it came to dealing with the Soviet Union, he followed the standard American line. Why? To protect American interests. That's his job. But during his campaign, he ran with one key difference: having an emphasis on human rights. Which should be pretty common, but okay. During the Carter presidency, he told the Latin American dictatorships to tone down the brutality. Not stop. Just tone it down. They understood this and they had a wonderful time working together. And by wonderful time, I mean they absolutely hated him. They didn't take too kindly to this, but an insane example of this was the Argentinian dictatorship response. They were so pissed off that the Carter administration froze aid that they, and I wish I was joking, they believed that the Carter NSA advisor Brzezinski was head of a global conspiracy. You know, Kanye.
Rahm Emanuel was right there next to Obama. Jared Kushner was right there next to Trump. What are those two people, those two Zionists? Oh, I gave it away.
When Timmerman told them that Brzezinski was Catholic, they responded with this: "They know you are Jewish because they studied the New York City phone book and found a number of Brzezinskis had Jewish first names." I can't. I cannot. Oh my god. Why do I bring this all up? This shows the metamorphosis of a man who was laughed at as a crazy person to a serious power broker with the US and other governments around the world. But Moon and the church's power has been criticized since the very beginning, and they have faced many struggles and even demise at some points. The church will face some of their toughest challenges soon. Very soon. But, for now, the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, along with the Soviet Union and its client states. This is a massive achievement for Moon, obviously, a cause he has been fighting for his entire life, with an emphatic victory. With this came a change in the trajectory of the church's goals. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ronald Reagan was at the end of his second term, and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, was running to continue the Reagan administration's policies, even though, for some, he really didn't want to.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
He raised taxes. Now, Bush was kinda in a corner here, due to Reagan being extremely popular, that he had to continue in Reagan's footsteps in some ways. When H.W. Bush ran against Ronald Reagan in the 1980s Republican primary, he called trickle-down economics voodoo economics. But winning the Cold War came at a massive cost to the United States. The federal deficit ballooned, and the money had to come from somewhere. Speaking of which, where did Boone get all of his money? Never mind. Anyways, when it came to beating the Soviets by spending an insane amount of money on the military, a project that Reagan wanted and was famously derided for in the media as crazy, was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as it's commonly known as, Star Wars. Now, the logic of the Cold War was basically this: I shoot at you, you shoot at me, everyone dies, with the Earth becoming a barren, uninhabited wasteland. This was known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. But the policy falls apart in a lot of ways. The Soviets had nukes, so did the People's Republic of China. MAD falls apart if you don't know who fired the first shot. So this being obviously very bad, Reagan wanted to try a new approach where you defend rather than responding to just a nuclear attack. By having a defense system in space, you can stop ICBMs from sending in nuclear weapons. That would render nuclear weapons obsolete. This would be achieved by using a method of space travel that has not and probably will never be invented. But that didn't deter supporters of this policy. The Washington Times supported SDI, as did the American Freedom Coalition, as they ran pro-SDI commercials and made films highlighting the need for this program. What's the American Freedom Coalition? Well, I'm glad you asked. They were a grassroots conservative political organization that was around during the 90s. They supported the SDI, Operation Desert Storm, and getting H.W. Bush elected. Why are they here? Well, according to reports, nearly 1/3 of its funding came from Unification Church interest. In fact, I'm underestimating the amount of support that the church has given to the organization. The AFC sent a letter to Reverend Moon basically saying that the AFC would not exist without the Moon organization. Moon, along with the American Freedom Coalition, pumped millions of dollars to help the H.W. Bush campaign get elected. They sent out millions of flyers to support him. The Washington Times also was used to spread baseless rumors about Dukakis being incompetent. H.W. Bush won the election in a landslide. Not like Reagan did 4 years earlier, but still a landslide nonetheless. If you had to guess, who would be Moon's favorite president? It would be Ronald Reagan, right? The staunch anti-communism, family values, the importance of God, all that stuff. But the real answer is George H.W. Bush. Why? Because out of all the presidents, he was the closest to Moon. not just supporting his election, but he would go on Moon-endorsed speaking tours after he lost the 1992 election. Bush was there when Moon started a Spanish-language newspaper called Tiempos del Mundo out of Latin America. Now, Moon has faced a lot of skepticism starting the paper, but having a former president of the United States helps you a lot, obviously. And obviously, Bush was not doing this out of the kindness of his heart. He did it for cold, hard cash. His appearances ranged from $100,000 to $500,000, netting up to $10 million. The Washington Times gave $1 million for the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library. This all happened, like I said earlier, after George H.W. Bush lost the 1992 election to Bill Clinton. Now, with a Democrat in the White House, he lost a lot of his political clout. The only thing he was able to get done with Clinton, really, was to get Parents' Day signed into law. The holiday is from the church called True Parents' Day, but he sold it as a non-denominational thing. During the 90s, there was some worry that the media would cover the church's ties to the GOP extensively while the Democrats were dealing with the 1996 Chinese campaign finance scandal. Or, a nickname it was called at the time, was Chinagate. What did I say? What did I say earlier? Now, having China trying to influence government policy is very concerning. But that criticism falls flat when you have the former president of your party is with a guy who believes he's the second coming of Christ, and that's not even the worst of it. When Moon first came to America, he talked about how America was just so good, the best nation, the one who will decide the fate of the world. Now, at this point in time, he was called America the kingdom of Satan. The country that represents Satan's harvest is America. Moon had embedded himself in the conservative infrastructure, and of course, they was not going to say anything about him. Do you know how hard it is to defend some of the stuff Moon has said while trying to critique other people? To cast yourself as the pro-America party when one of your biggest donors is calling America the country of Satan? I would keep my mouth shut. When conservative groups worked with Moon, they often did so holding their noses. But even after all the stuff Moon has said, they want the checks to keep on rolling in. With the Cold War now over, it was time to focus on his other big policy goal: Korean reunification. I mean, it makes sense, because they are the Unification Church. Now the real question is, how do you get in touch with the North Korean government? Simple. You give millions of dollars to Kim Il-sung and the North Korean government. Wait, aren't they still a communist dictatorship? Yes, but money. The Cold War is over. What are you worried about? With the Soviet Union now being Russia and being really, really broke, obviously they weren't sending North Korea and the other client states aid anymore. He invested tens of millions of dollars in North Korea when most Western observers thought that the regime would collapse without having any foreign currency reserves. Also, this was around the same time a Japanese newspaper investigation claimed that Moon was allegedly, and I mean allegedly, was involved in a deal that enhanced North Korean long-range missile research, which could greatly help the Kim regime's missile capabilities. It wasn't a small investment either. Joint cooperation with tourism, light industry, river development, they even set up a car company in the country. He also gave Kim Jong-il a small birthday present of around $3 million. How nice of him. Now still, I want to emphasize that all of this happened after the Cold War was over, and plenty of other governments like Japan, South Korea, and the United States were all trying to get North Korea to open up. But due to Moon's political connections and having lots and lots of money, he was able to visit Kim Il-sung 9 years before South Korea introduced their Sunshine policy to have friendly relations with the North. But a wrench was thrown into things was due to Moon's paper, the Washington Times. They were publishing stories about the horrors of North Korea and their communist gulags, and all around their terrible record on human rights. So basically, the paper that they own was saying, "You suck and you're terrible," while them themselves were saying, "You're great and wonderful, let's invest in you." Was this smart? The main criticism from Moon's opponents was that they helped the Kim regime become even stronger. On the other side, they see it as a much more broader, failed effort to have better relations with North Korea. But one thing we can say in hindsight was how durable the Kim regime actually is adapting to changes in the political wind. Since the fear of communism wasn't as pressing with the Soviet Union now gone, the church changed their focus. In fact, they were no longer a church, but a movement. This is where the name of the church changed to its current logo and current name, the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. It became a movement, and it shifted from anti-communism to family values. One core tenet of the church in matters of relation, sex, they are the chosen ones after all, but two books that were published during this time period by people who personally knew Moon was Nansook Hong, ex-wife of Heung Jim Moon, called In the Shadow of the Moon, and The Tragedy of the Six Marys by Park Chung-hwa. And they really put those claims to the test and would do serious damage to the church's image. Nansook Hong grew up in the Unification Church and was married to Heung Jin, the eldest son of the Moon family. When she was 15 years old, she was married to Heung Jim Moon. He was 20 years old. She lived with the family for about 14 years, and she details the amount of abuse she experienced from her husband. Heung Jin was unfaithful to her, and that's saying the very least. He told her he was able to sleep with other women because he was ordained by God. Providential affairs, he said. But in the church's theology, adultery, or cheating on your partner, is a major sin. Also, when Moon was 40 years old, he got married to Hak Jahan. She was 17. I mean, he had to pick them around that age because he said it was providence. He told her he's doing the things like his father had done in the past. Don't worry, we're going to talk about him later. According to Hong, Heung Jin was drunk and high all the time and would lock himself in his room for literally days at a time. One night, he attacked her while she was 7 months pregnant. In the dead of night, she took her children and escaped from the Moon household. Heung Jin also owned a lot of firearms. He had a machine gun literally under his bed. Speaking of which, where did he get those firearms? Never mind. While doing research for this, and allegedly, I mean allegedly, things may have been done to him as a child by high-up church leader Peter Kim and others. And while that doesn't excuse any of his behavior, it does explain it somewhat. Moving over to Park Chung-hwa, he would release a tell-all book that left lasting damage to the church and risked the church's efforts in Japan at that time. Park was one of Moon's early followers and claims that the early sales pitch for the church was a harem of young girls. Moon would use these women to recruit 3 men each to the church. Sounds very pyramid-shaped in my opinion. He says the real roots of the religion is in Korean shamanism. The insane thing about this claim is that it's not even new. US Defense and FBI reports were saying the same thing previously for decades. Reports claim he would be in dark rooms with these women and caress their bodies while reciting long prayers for 24 hours straight. And that's not even the full account of him dealing with women. There's an entire sex scandal around him in 1995 at AY University, where 14 students were dismissed because Moon allegedly was luring young girls to do a pracarum, or blood ritual / blood purification, that for a female to be purified from their original sin, you must have sex with a messiah type in order to regain the purity that was lost. The evolution of this ceremony was the mass wedding ceremonies. Moon was arrested in South Korea for either draft dodging or the scandal. But Nansook said in her book, at the time, adultery was a criminal offense in the country, and Moon sent a son by his lover to go live in Japan in 1975, but he would perish in a train accident in 1969. The church publicly denies this connection, but many reports and that Moon, even in private, has claimed this all to be true. Why do organizations like this always have attempts to justify why members must sleep with their leader? But that's a story for another time as well. But while Moon was on tour with George H.W. Bush in Latin America, Park suddenly retracted his story, a book he started writing in 1985. The book was released in 1993. Suddenly, after writing this book for 8 years, he claims he held a massive grudge against Moon. But now, he finally sees Moon as the Messiah. And now, there's not any evidence that Park Chung-hwa was paid or violently coerced by the Unification Church to retract the book that he was writing for nearly a decade. There's no evidence whatsoever. It's just a coincidence. Yep, just a coincidence. I'm just saying. There's not any evidence. None. In the 1990s, Moon's adventures in Latin America would continue, where he bought a large bank in Uruguay, invested $100 million, equal to 1/10 of the country's exports, bought properties in Argentina, and bought Banco de Credico, one of the largest banks in Latin America, and a lot of accusations of dealing with the drug trade. Bought very valuable land in Paraguay, like if you wanted to control the fresh water supply, and like if you want to smuggle narcotics. So, just a coincidence. But one of the most notable things during this time period was a project Moon was trying to build in Brazil called a new Garden of Eden. But that plan was abandoned after the land was raided by Brazilian police. When the 2000s came, it was great news when H.W. Bush's son became president. George W. Bush. He came along with his talk of family values and marriage between one man and one woman, but W. Bush was not as close to Moon like compared to his father. One of Moon's operatives, Douglas Ju, and Times president, was born in North Korea and was used as an intermediary between the countries of the US and North Korea. But critics say Ju wasn't really effective in helping US and North Korean relations. Well, we're reaching the end of the timeline. There's not really a lot left. One of Moon's magazines called Insight published a story that Obama spent 4 years in a Muslim school in Indonesia, which was debunked soon afterwards. Moon would begin handing off control to his children until he would pass away in 2012, with his wife, Hak Jahan, leading the church till this present moment. Oh yeah, one last thing. I want to tell a small story about how the US Congress crowned Sun Myung Moon Emperor of the Universe. Wait, what? Yeah, he told the crowd, quote, "He is none other, humanity's savior, Messiah, returning Lord, and true parent." Yeah, that's just no big deal. He gave a big speech about how he helped Hitler and Stalin be reborn as new people. And somehow, the US Congress just crowned Moon the Messiah, Lord of the Fourth Israel. And yeah, it's an insane story, really. Now, there's a reason as to why I don't go into that much detail explaining how the US Congress crowned Moon the Messiah. Because now you know what it feels like covering the church ever since Moon has left prison since 1985. The media rarely, and I mean rarely, ever talk about him. These days, the church will have to do something like super out the ordinary in order to get any coverage. That's not happening anytime soon. Which is kind of insane due to how much money Moon and the church has poured in and the sheer amount of influence they've held. Not just the United States, but so many other countries. If you're an older person watching this video, it must feel like deja vu. Like the guy, when most people thought he went away and disappeared, became so much more influential than you can possibly imagine. He's a major political donor, a power player, not just in the United States, but so many other countries. But when we hear about him, it's like some passing joke in Seinfeld.
What I want you to do is to go into the shop with me and tell me what they're saying. You do speak Korean.
I once talked to the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He bought 2 Jesus statues from me. He's a hell of a nice guy. You ever seen that face on him? It was like a big apple pie.
I think back to when I first saw that video. The video of those marriages. Those big mass marriages during the beginnings of the pandemic. And I wondered, why did no one cover this? I just wanted to talk about the marriage ceremony and how weird it was getting all these people all across the world. But to just tell that story would feel wrong. The church is not something that went away during the 1980s. It has been a key player in major countries' politics for nearly half a century. Politics can't be separated from the religion. Neither is business. Everything is interconnected. And to be fair, all 3 of those things do have massive impacts on people's lives. Which, to be fair, which is more interesting? Mass marriages, or that time my dead Korean son was reincarnated into a black man? I mean, come on, the video writes itself. All the names that Moon has been involved with, leaders from Korea, Japan, the Philippines, France, and many, many more. Nearly every single Republican president since Nixon has interacted with him. Actually, since Eisenhower. Moon wanted the photo with Eisenhower to make him look even more important than he was at the time. Moon really lives by the motto, fake it until you make it. Even President Joe Biden has a small connection to Moon, but that is a story for another time. Moon was a man that was shaped by the Cold War, just like a lot of people during the time period. It was a time in world history where the world was split into binaries. Good versus evil, capitalism versus communism, God versus the devil. But real life does not work that way. The devils weren't really evil, and the saints weren't really that good. Life is nuanced and complex, and just really hard. But the binary way of thinking is very attractive for obvious reasons. We are good, they are bad, and once we win, everything will be okay. But it won't. You can't take back all the damage you've caused in pursuit of your goals, no matter who you are. Treating people any way you like, regardless of what happens to them. No matter what, no matter who you are, even if you are the Messiah, sooner or later, God will cut you down. And a word of advice if you ever find yourself in this situation. Please, just don't get caught in the crossfire.